We're going to record this to the cloud. This is R622 on designing learning environments. We're entering week 12, which just happens to be related to designing learning environments. Smarter ones we can get to next week, smart learning environments. After Stephanie leaves after break, I'll talk about smarter learning environments or dumber learning environments, as the case may be. But Stephanie Moore has actually written about the ecology of learning and published one piece last year that's in the syllabus for this week. If I would actually have the syllabus sitting in front of me, I would read what that article is. So it is called Online Learning Ecosystems. And the subtitle is Comprehensive Planning for and Support for Distance Learning in a Tier 1 journal with my good friend Sam Nadu as editor, called Distance Education. That came out in 2022. So that's why when I found that article I'm on the board for that journal. So when I was sent the issue that was in, I said, well, I need to include that in this.
Uh-oh, I hope we haven't lost him.
It's my fault. It's because I was making fun of his computer.
Oh,
Right.
this happens. Am I back now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so it tells me when I'm back, when it indicates says your connection is unstable, and then I know I'm back because at least they caught that, every once in a while. So I think we're moving away from Comcast or Uverse, AT&T to some Smithville here in town, which is Cat 5 cabling or whatever whatever that's called. So soon. I'm sure a keynote I'll give someday will go like this. I mean, I'll be keynoting to Vietnam or something. All of a sudden, oh, they can't hear me anymore. So Stephanie's written this one piece, and she's got a second one that she's working on, apparently, a follow-up piece or maybe an extension piece. So we'll talk about that. I don't want you to mention it now. I want you to wait until we talk other things about you, until we get to that articles.
Okay.
So it's a real privilege to have Stephanie with us because she is the editor now, the lead editor, or what they call that, editor-in-chief, or all those titles.
Whatever.
Journal of Computing in Higher Education, which is a top-tier journal. It's SSCI. For a while, before Stephanie arrived, or just when she arrived, it had a little bit of a backlog for a while, and she's cleaned some of the backlog up. I don't know how she cleaned it up, but she did. And so that journal is one that I will recommend. Unlike some of the ones I talked about in previous weeks that take long times. So JC, Journal of Computing, HE. You want to take a look for. So this week 10 is on designing effective online learning environments. And we can talk about anything any week, by the way. It just happens to have that title for this particular week. I want to see if there's anything else in this week. So Jan Harrington is a pretty well-known person on authentic learning. We've read from her previously, along with Tom Reeves at Georgia and Ron Oliver in Australia. They have an article on patterns of engagement in authentic online learning. They also have a book on authentic online learning that you can find free if you look hard enough. Then Florence Martin and I and Vanessa Denon wrote a piece, like an introductory piece for our special issue of ETR&D a couple of years ago, a synthesis of systematic reviews of the research on emerging learning technologies. Joy Moore, who's a person I'll probably bring in next time I teach this course. She's at the University of Missouri, ran for president of ACT a couple of years ago. A good friend. She hung out with me in Bangkok 16 years ago for our conference. She has an article on e-learning, online learning, distance learning environments, trying to sort out what the three are, with two co-authors in there, Camille Dixon-Dean and one other. Then Elaine Coe and I have a free book called Adding Tech Variety, which just came out in a smaller version, updated version, with a free class attached to it. So that Adding Tech Variety one activities has been downloaded more than a couple 100,000 times. And now the free book is available from the Commonwealth of Learning. And so that's listed in there too. It's called Motivation and Supporting Online Learners. Maha Bali, my good friend at American University of Cairo, is a popular writer for the Chronicle of Higher Ed and blogger, and does a lot in social emotional well-being. She has an article, Online Does Not Mean Isolated, from Inside Higher Education. She's a lovely person, great person. You'll maybe find her at a keynote someday. Do attend her sessions. She's got 2 co-authors on that article. Then there's a couple Silver Lining for Learning podcast episodes. One with my good friend Maxim Jean Louis from Contact North in Ontario. It's basically the distance learning arm for the province of Ontario, trying to get education to the northern far reaches, to the hinterlands, to places where First Nation people might live and might not have educational opportunities otherwise. So I'm a research fellow with Contact North. I'll be giving a speech in 2 weeks on the use of podcasts and webcasts in education for Contact North. That'll be right before, the day before Thanksgiving, actually, that share with your friends. Then the other one that's for a podcast for this week is called Global Eyes for Global Ed, Transforming Learning Through Cross-Cultural Project-Based Learning Among K-12 Kids, mostly high school kids. The Contact North one is called Making Contact with Contact North, of course. So there's a lot of good stuff for this week. You know, Stephanie, you've got a lot to compete with your article, so I want to highlight it, right?
Yeah, thank you.
So, you know, your journey has kind of ebbed and flowed into different places. You know, I see big brothers and big sisters, right? In there, I think I saw, not Kinko's? Did I see Kinko's?
Yeah, I worked at Kinko's a long time ago.
So, you know, why don't you tell us all, maybe not all, but the kind of the logical sequence, the chronological sequence of the places where you've worked at, and it might
Sure.
help people understand your perspective on why we need to build ecologies of learning or learning environments today. Your rich
Sure.
background might inform us. So take us through that from your undergraduate, since you got your degree in what, 1996 or so, to
I
today.
don't even remember. You you put it on your CV and then you forget, right? So yeah, so my undergraduate is in English. And while I was working on that, I became editor-in-chief of our yearbook when we were still doing yearbooks in colleges.
What college was this?
Oklahoma Baptist University. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and yeah, Shawnee, America is where most folks went. Although I will say OBU is a private liberal arts university, and I know that may sound like a contradiction. But at the time anyway, it was really and truly a liberal arts university. Like I as editor of the yearbook, I got to interview the president of the university, and we had a fantastic conversation about liberal arts education and what does that mean. And as part of that time, as I said, I became editor. And I was one of the few folks who edited it for 2 years. I became an editor as a junior, which is unusual. You know, usually it's a senior. And that experience was very formative for me. So, you know, as an English major, of course, I was reading a lot of literature, a lot of grammar theory, a lot of critical theory, you know, things like that. But also, of course, doing a lot of writing and a lot of developing, and really earned a lot of my tech chops there. Because, of course, we were on Macs with PageMaker.
That makes Megan happy.
Time, right. Right. And you know, I will say I actually started doing this when we literally cut and paste. So we would have these paper layouts, you know, with measured by picas, and you'd have to type up your headline and your text and print it out and cut it out and paste it and ship that off to the publisher. And then we shifted, you know, to software like PageMaker. And so when I graduated, I was at the time I was married to somebody whose major was music theory and composition. He was jazz player, very creative, you know, composed music. And everybody kept asking us, what are you going to do? And we said, well, you know, between English and music, I think we're going to starve. So, right. So I parlayed my my tech and editing skills really into working for Kinko's, and even that, like the the job interview in and of itself is its own story, but I'll skip that. But we had to take a test, and and because of how I'd performed on it, they said, we really want you to work at our Irving location in Dallas, Fort Worth, which is the big one. And I didn't know this at the time, but this was basically the top performing location within all of their locations. And in addition to having the customer facing front end, we had an entire back end operation that was in a separate building back behind the store location itself as well. And so we worked with Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies that were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, like American Airlines right down the road, Sprint also right down the road in the other direction. We did work for Nickelodeon and Oscar Mayer and others that would come in. So our team would develop pretty much anything. You really had to be a jack of all trades. It could be any material. And then we started branching off into web design when that took off. And it could be any size, shape, scope, whatever. You really had to be able to run with that ball. So, so I developed pretty serious, design and development chops in that environment. And we had fast turnaround times too. So we typically had to turn things around in 24 to 48 hours, regardless of the project. So, it's a team of us working on that. And, the year I was there, we ended up being the top location in the country and actually got to meet Kinko himself. So
the real person?
He's a real person. That's a nickname. Kinko's a nickname. He has really tight curly hair, and he had opened up a, photocopy shop and a mobile van or something like that, and then expanded it. And neat guy. So
kinks in his hair. So
yeah,
Kinko.
yeah,
okay.
Because of very tight curls. He had been nicknamed Kinko's, and so that's what he called it. Yep. So from there, I continued doing that and doing some of my work in like a marketing context, really. And eventually just got dissatisfied with that. I wasn't really enjoying simply designing for increased revenue. And I had decided I wanted to continue my English. So I actually started a master's in English. And while I was doing that, I got into a class on classical Greek rhetoric, of all things, where we read a piece called Phaedrus, where they talk about the introduction of writing into the academy, this new techne that's being imported over, and this really big debate over, well, how does this change the meaning? How does this change a student's understanding? How does this change the relationship between students and their teacher? And of course, in this piece, Plato wrote it, but he wrote it in the voice of Socrates, as this dialogue between Socrates and Phaedrus, the student. And Plato really didn't like writing, despite the fact that he used a lot of writing very effectively. But he really felt that in the academy that this degraded the learning experience and degraded the relationships and basically violated that sort of sacred space that exists between the instructor and the student. And I got really fascinated by this and kind of decided, I think the world has enough English PhDs, and it might be good for the world to have a few more folks who are really thinking about critical issues around technology. And so that's when I kind of started to make more of a turn and got drawn into the EdTech program I was in Colorado at this time. That was at UNC. Kay Persicchiti was there at the time, and Ed Caffarella. So I started working with them on EdTech and decided, I really enjoy this. I enjoy this orientation of developing things for a purpose other than bottom lines. And taking these skills that I had and applying them. And I was also really interested in some of these complex ethical challenges. So I finished my master's. My master's basically kind of half English, half ed tech. And I did a thesis on moving to new mediums. creating content in hypertext at the time. That was just all the rage. And then when I finished that, Kay invited me to do my PhD there at UNC. And as part of that, I started working with her and our special ed department on developing online programs. So this was around 99, 2000 or so. And we were developing an online program for blindness and visual impairment. And because of that, because of the orientation of that program, we had a larger number of students and even instructors who had visual impairments as well. So we were having to figure out how to develop solutions around that before we had any of these nice checklists. There were a few accessibility checkers already, but we didn't have checklists or things like that to really guide accessibility. We were having to craft solutions from whole cloth. And I loved that space. And that experience has greatly shaped me as an online designer, thinking about not just how we put content online or, multimedia or things like that, but really ensuring that when we design these environments, we're thinking about who we're designing them for. And when you design for something like accessibility or, learners with different disabilities, it forces you as a designer to step back and unpack some of the things that you are designing and that you're thinking about. In this case, we really had to rethink or be more explicit or thoughtful about the messages in our designs and how we ensured that users who were using screen readers, for example, or Braille keyboards, how they were getting the same messages that we were sending visually to other learners through our design as well. So those are some of my most formative experiences.
Well, I'll pick up on a couple things quickly, and we'll move on to other. So English happens to be, I think, the most popular major for people applying to ed tech programs from East Asia. Sunmei came from East Asia in engineering. That's another popular area. A lot of people leave computer science and engineering because they want to be more applied. They want to make an impact. They don't want to just be stuck in a tunnel somewhere in a giant field of other engineers, or in my case, other accountants. You can actually see the impact of your work in this field quite quickly, as you mentioned, even just with hypertext. But I think if I remember reviewing applicants, many from China, many from Korea have English as a background. And you know why they have English as a background? Sunmei, why do they have English as a background? Why do you think?
I don't understand exactly. So you mean that is why many English major Asian students major in IST?
Yeah.
Something like that?
Yeah.
I don't know, but just in my country, English is really popular. Even, just everyone is supposed to learn English. It's a really, really popular topic.
Yeah. So that's one reason is the English. And tonight I just got an email from someone at Michigan State. She was at both, wanting to come here for a doctorate. She's studying ESL and teaching of English. That's one reason. The second reason is that people who major in English score better on the GREs and can get in.
That's true. Yes.
or they're math majors in computer or engineering. They score better on the GRE math side. So those are the two areas. The other score high in quantitative, or they score high on the written part and the verbal part. So that's my interpretation anyhow. And it does seem to benefit. There might be a whole swath of other reasons why English is predominant, but those are among them. I also want to mention UNC. Megan's got her hand up here. Did you want to add? No. So I want to mention.
Just relaxing.
UNC is not University of North Carolina.
Right.
Or University of North Carolina. It is University of Northern Colorado up in Greeley, where they have cow slaughtering places and all sorts of things that make the city not smell so nice. I've heard.
They did move those. They're now like 50 to 100 miles outside of the city, but they were still there at first when we first lived there.
Okay, yeah, because in 1990, so Ellen Wagner, the past president or the director of AECT used to be the department chair at Northern Colorado, but I think she had left before you arrived or around
That's
when
right.
you arrived.
That's right.
They had other people who are pretty well known too, besides Kay. And I can't remember the woman. I wrote a 10-year letter for her. She was more of a teaching professor there. That's maybe they're still there now. So Northern Colorado probably has more ed tech than the University of Colorado, and you would,
Right.
you would, and more than Colorado State, which are the two bigger universities close
Right.
by.
Right.
So a number of ed tech people have predominant in the field have gotten their doctorates from Northern Colorado. I just want to mention that as well. Do you want to continue where you left off at this point?
Oh, that's up to you.
Okay.
I love how you're taking us along a journey. So I'll go where you lead, Kurt.
Yeah. So you got your degree at Northern. What was your first stopping point after completing that? And
yeah, so and this is where things get a little bit more personal, but I think students will appreciate it, especially given how things have turned out. But so on my on the night of my dissertation, before my dissertation defense, my ex-husband served me with court papers for custody for our child and said, "Good luck tomorrow."
Oh, 3 days before I defended, my son showed up from Korea. And he was waiting in the hallway while I defended, and the opposite for me. They all wanted to meet my son, so they passed me on my defense really fast so they could meet my son. So all sorts of custody issues happen around defense time.
Yeah. So
Megan's shaking her head.
Kaufman,
Oh no!
Yeah. And so given what I was working in, Roger Kaufman was actually on my committee, even though he was at Florida State. So I'd done a lot of work with Roger. Yeah.
Real famous guy. How did you get someone from Florida State to help you out?
It's a great AECT story. I met Jim, my husband now, at AECT, and we were talking about what I was interested in. He said, "You really should read Roger Kaufman's work. I think this aligns with how you're talking and thinking about ethics in the field and trying to frame things." And so he sent Roger my prospectus that I had already written. And Roger replied the next day and said, I'd love to serve on this. And so thus began a long, wonderful several years of working with Roger. He passed away a few years ago, and I miss him deeply. But yeah, so he served on my committee as basically as co-chair of my committee because his model was so central to my dissertation topic, and then we continued to work beyond that. But
so people might have read Roger Kaufman in here in R511, maybe 711, more likely R511. We get into HPT, human performance technology, and corporate training, and all that side of it. So maybe in weeks 10, 11, 12 in my R511, you'll find an article from Kaufman and some other people that maybe Stephanie. I'm curious, your husband's last name?
Ellsworth.
Ellsworth, okay. And his first name again? Jim?
Jim.
I've run into that name too, I think, yeah.
He has a book on change. So he was a change scholar, studied with Don Ely at the Syracuse program. Right. And but he was Army. So he spent most of his career in the field, retired as a one-star intelligence general, but still talks like one of us. So
I worked with the Army as a fellow, and I don't think I am ever going to earn a 1-star or even a half-star. But they had put me to work doing some emerging technologies research with them.
Yeah. It's a fun context to work in.
Always
very well
edge.
Resourced.
Very well resourced. They read everything. Everything.
I think I sent along two for you. So he and I both been toying with this idea of ecosystems that, that I've written on here, but he actually just this past year finished the Army Learning Ecosystem 2.0 for them. So he had actually been part of writing.
Did you do 1.0? It came out in 2015, or so it was written for 2015. It came out maybe before 2015. I've seen that. So
Yep.
that's where I saw
So
the
he
name.
worked on
maybe.
that on the
Right,
first vision for the
right.
Army. And if you understand DoD, basically as
Wow.
goes Army, so goes DoD.
So I
You
was a
know,
fellow for
they're
DoD as well. After
yeah.
after Army Research Institute, then I went to DoD. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so they asked him to come back after the pandemic, and they realized, gosh, we're not really we're not our infrastructure isn't really ready for this kind of shift. And so they asked him to put together sort of the vision for Army Learning 2.0. What's the next generation vision for this? And he leaned into this idea of ecosystems there as well. And so that's we do spend a lot of our time kind of talking around that space. And he, like me, you know, I've got this career over 20 years of developing online learning, and he's got what, probably 30 years or so of developing online learning systems as well. So this is an idea that we're really noodling a lot with right
Yeah.
now. But
Can you send me that? I'll forward to the class
I will.
the
Yeah.
2.0 report.
I've been
I
poking
may
him to get it for you.
I may have it already, but I don't think I've shared it with the class here, and I might not
Okay.
have ready access to it. So do send that. That came out like a year and a half ago, or a year ago, or what? Or
Maybe
more
a
recent?
year ago.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think he put the final touches on it last fall.
Right.
And now they're sort of working on, okay, how do we pick off different parts of this and start to actually implement this plan?
Mm. Yeah, I'm sure we've run into some similar people. Does the name Bob Wisher ring a bell?
No,
Ask
it
him if
might for
it
Jim
does.
though.
Yeah,
Okay.
write it down and ask him if it does. I'll bet it does. He was the one I reported to. He took someone's place in the DoD who died on 9/11. The airplane
Mm,
killed him. So Bob was at ARI. He was a
in the
Purdue
Pentagon.
graduate in the He was at the Army Research Institute, not in the Pentagon, at some place in the Virginia side, and then moved to the Pentagon when he became the director at DoD,
Okay.
right below the Undersecretary of Defense. Yeah, so he was involved in all training for the military, in effect, before he retired. So, you know, you've done a lot. If you look at, you know, all your interest areas, I mean, multimedia, blended learning, performance improvement, educational emerging technologies, the ethics of technology, design and planning of technology. I mean, A to Z, you're interested in it. Online learning, e-learning, this is whatever you want to call it. So someone who is interested in everything finds that they have everyone's their audience, but no one is their audience oftentimes. You wonder sometimes who you're speaking to, because everyone's got their little niches that they pursue.
Right.
And there's others of us who are in many areas, sometimes pursuing one like blended learning full bore for a couple of years, and then other times something else. Maybe in your case, ethics might be
Right.
something that you choose to get into. Because you've moved in and out of those different areas, what do you find as a home to you in terms of conferences, or in terms of journals that you read, or magazines, or, you know, people that you want to get their latest book? You know, what do generalists out there really, what are they attracted to? What keeps you moving?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of that has evolved just out of sheer necessity over time. You know, my career path has not been a normal career path by any stretch, because life and I feel very blessed to be where I'm at right now. It's not common to kind of overcome those obstacles and still land in a tenure track position. But so that's kind of where that eclecticism comes from, right? I appreciate the fact that I have an education and experience background that has really given me a range of different tools or body of work to be able to pull on, depending upon what a context or a project needs. But yeah, so where do I feed my interests? You know, the ethics has been a very persistent interest of mine. And at times that has felt like I've needed to persist in that work, even despite naysayers or others saying, this just really isn't a significant thing to focus on. I think we're seeing that shift right now. More and more folks are becoming attuned to various issues, whether it's accessibility, equity, data rights and privacy, things like that, that really are part and parcel of the work that we do. So right now, especially in that space, I actually tend to find a lot more of my inspiration from outside of our field because we have so little work in our field. I mean, I tend to describe that as like a meteor-sized crater. And I feel like the work I do is like putting a few shovelfuls of dirt in there, to try and fill this gap. But other fields have very robust bodies of work and frameworks and whatnot to be able to draw on, including other design and technology oriented disciplines, like engineering or computer science or architecture or even the military. They have entire ethics departments and talk about the ethics of technology in warfare and in war fighting, psychological impacts of that or whatnot. So in that space, I really tend to draw a lot of my inspiration, or have tended over the years, I should say, to draw my inspiration from outside. Now, right now, we've kind of had a mini explosion of discussions on like DEI, culture, some of these other topics. And so some of the folks that I've been reading lately include like Patricia Young's work on culture and some of the work on DEI. I'm not wholly satisfied with what I'm seeing in our field right now, but it's nascent and we're starting. On the online side, I draw from very classic literature. I mean, I studied Morn and Kiersey. I feel like I'm not getting that quite right.
Curiously.
Thank you. I was like, there's an L in there somewhere. No.
It's Greg Kearsley, if you try and look it up, and Michael Moore, the father of distance ed
right.
at Penn State, basically, yeah.
Right. Types of interaction, types of presence, social presence, a community of inquiry model, all of that. So, I mean, for that, obviously, I really tend to focus more on the journals and some of the books in our field. When I teach on online learning, I use a book called Learning Online by Barbara Means.
Right.
It's Means, Bacchia, and Murphy, because I really like their summary of what the research has to say. And how to convey that research.
She's been on my podcast show, and
great.
If you take R678 with me, she's done the meta-analysis about the effectiveness of online or blended or face-to-face, and finds that blended is best across. She's at Stanford Research Institute. And so again, if you take my course, it won't be till not this spring, the following spring, or you just download my syllabus and take a look. Barbara Means. Very accomplished person.
Yeah.
So I've circled about 20 names in your syllabus I want to ask you about. So after you make your next point, I'm gonna go through this list with you.
No, go ahead. I don't remember. I don't remember
what you're gonna say. I interrupted.
Yeah.
So I look at your syllabus and I see these people like Roger Kaufman, and is it Glenn Bull? At Virginia, was Bull?
Glenn Bull was at Virginia. Yeah, UVA.
Ellen Wagner's in there, Jill Stefanik. I see Camille Dixon, Albert Ritzoff, MG Bishop, Michael Spector, Kay Bursity, all these people, Charles Hodges, Whitney Kilgore, all my friends are people I know. But then I see Barbara. So two questions I'm going to ask you. So I'll do one first. Barbara Lockey and Aaron Bond and you and Charles Hodges, and I don't know who T Trust. What's T Trust? Is
Tori Trust. She's at UMass Amherst.
So Barbara Lockey was in my class. We brought her in 2 years ago, maybe a year ago. She's been promoted now at Virginia Tech up the food chain. She's a very lovely person, very a spirit within the field. When you talk to her, there's going to be it's going to be uplifting day.
That's right.
So you've written this piece with her when the pandemic came out. I mean, it came out March 27th, 2020. Okay.
Mhm.
So our podcast show started March 21st because the pandemic started around then. I started running that day. I'm still running. So it's 962 days ago. And now your piece came out 956 days ago. So in 956 days, that article has been cited thousands of times. It's Barbara Lockheed's most cited article ever. And she's got a long and very productive career. I'm sure all of you are in that case where it's the cited article you've ever written. Very thoughtful piece for EDUCAUSE and EDUCAUSE review articles. Often you get a lot of surface level articles. Great, I like reading EDUCAUSE, but that piece it covers a lot of interesting territory. Do you want to tell my students about what that article is about and why it got so cited in your opinion?
In my opinion, right? Because part of me has really baffled by the phenomenon. So first of all, we were watching the discourse over online take off, of course, as the pandemic started to unfold, especially in the early days. And the discourse around online was really divorced from what we knew from the research. And so Chuck and I had already written a piece together for Inside Higher Ed that was on, so you want to move online quickly. And where we tried to distill down, very quickly, like here, if you've got 2 weeks or whatever, here are the things to focus on to get something up and running very quickly. And then as soon as that came out, and that one hasn't been cited a lot, but it was shared everywhere. We were like, we really need to tackle what's going on around in the discourse right now. And there were a number of us on Twitter in particular who kept saying, what you're describing isn't really online learning. This is a different thing, and we need a different term for that. And we kept kind of circulating around this term of emergency remote teaching. And so, Chuck emailed the group of us and said, hey, I think EDUCAUSE is interested. Let's write this piece. So we sat down and started putting that together. But our mission, our goal, that we really wanted to get a research-informed perspective out into the public in such a way that we could hopefully head off some of the dialogue that was taking shape. I think you could see where everything was going, that people were already starting to use the pandemic and what was going on as an excuse to draw conclusions and confirm their own biases about online learning, that, it doesn't work, it's a poor substitute, we should never use it. All these things that were really inconsistent with, again, with the research that we knew. So our primary objective was really just try to inject some research into the dialogue. We had no idea that this would take off the way that it did. I think one of the reasons it took off the way that it did is, first of all, it was very timely. We were able to get it out quickly. EDUCAUSE was fantastic to work with in that regard. So we were able to write this, get this out quickly, and inject it into the dialogue as that dialogue was happening. The other thing that I think is really sticky about that piece is what I see it cited as most often is the distinction that we made between emergency remote teaching and online learning. In other words, we were doing a little bit of construct definition in that article. And I think it was those construct definitions in particular that, at least in the subsequent things that I've read, that seems to be what a lot of folks really picked up on, was how is this construct different from that construct, and what are the implications of that for design and for decision making. And yeah, thank you for linking to it, Bo. And so how did that also help us navigate decision making and even be able to dissect some of the discourse or rhetoric that we were seeing at the time? Again, a little bit of that for me personally was drawing on this rhetoric or English background that I knew that we were you could tell from discourse that we were headed into a rhetorical battle over online learning, and we wanted to try our best to enter in a rhetorical argument for why what was happening during the pandemic is not anything anybody should look at and say, oh yeah, I'm going to base my decision or opinion on online learning on this over the next 20 years or whatever.
So that, open access makes a difference. And that's partly why it was.
Yes, that's right.
And short, it wasn't condensed, you cited research, but it wasn't a research piece. And
Right.
those tend to be the ones that are read more often. Last week, I had an article come out on 15 guidelines for self-directed learning in Open Learning Journal, but it's not open access, but it's still those kind of articles. Today, I had one accepted that's a sister article to that one about, I think we call it On the Trail of the Self-Directed Learning, summarizing our research over the past decade on self-directed learning,
Yeah.
which will be an open access article when it comes out in a special issue. So those are the kinds of things that are cited. Plus it was timing. So it's timing plus open access plus readability plus. So who wrote the intro to that article? I'm just curious.
That was me.
So that's another thing, writing an intro that's intriguing for people and brings you in and captures your interest, is because you're the English major. Of course, you wrote the intro.
Yep.
By the way, my dissertation was computer prompts and writing, so I was reading all that stuff, and and when I wrote the World is Open book, I was reading about Plato's criticisms about writing, and I have that in the preface or the opening of the book, a little scenario myself. So another person I want to bring out so that congrats on an article, first of all.
Thank you.
Congrats, because those. So another thing is, for my students out there, you just don't know what's going to be read. You still know it's going to be a hit. You keep plugging away.
There's no way.
Yeah. Sometimes you have a feel that this could be widely read. When you're writing it, you have a unique model or a table or something about maybe a title, even just a title. Again, the timing, so you can get a sense that at least it's something proud that you want to share with your friends. You just don't know if it'll be cited. It's one that you'll pick up, and like I did with my 15 guidelines last week, I shared it with a bunch of people because it's easy to read, it's summative, it conveys what we're doing over a long period of time. It doesn't get people too much into the weeds and so forth.
Right. So
I'm going to throw out another article here, Digital Narratives, Techniques and Design Considerations for Effective Living Histories and Documentaries, AECT Workshop, Louisville, Kentucky, 2009.
Oh my God.
And you're with someone named Tillman, but also with my friend Heather Tilburg Webb. How do you know Heather?
Oh God. So Heather and I know each other through AECT. I think I was an intern the year before she was at AECT, and we got to meet each other there. And not only that, but Heather and Jim had gotten into this big debate online, a big philosophical debate over postmodernism and all this other stuff. And so I think the next year, while we were there, we ended up going out for drinks with Heather and Johannes.
Right.
Yeah. And just Heather and I have just really clicked over. In fact, we just sent a book off for copy editing through Rutledge on ethics and educational technology.
Right now,
Heather and I have written together. Yeah. Just a month or so ago. Yeah, we'll get the copy editing back here in a month, I think.
So I'm having a powwow with the editor of Rutledge. When I come back, I go to New York, Rochester this week. And when I come back, I'm talking to the editor, but he is proposing something to me. So Daniel Schwartz, do you know Daniel Schwartz?
Yep. Okay. Dan's the one that we worked with. Yeah. So
as much. So Heather's got a book. That's great to know. Maybe we'll bring you and Heather back when we get into ethics next in 511 in the spring. We should do have a week on ethics. And I don't have many friends who are ethical, so no. And Bo just came down and visited me on Friday, so he says, "Wait a minute, I'm an ethical guy." And so before I open this up for questions, to prepare anything for us tonight about your new article on ecologies? You have any figures, frameworks that you want to put up on the document camera to share with us?
Well, I think I've ended up giving a lot of talks over the past several years because when the pandemic broke, I was at University of Virginia, and
Right.
um,
I remember.
Kurt will appreciate this comment that when you're at a place like UVA or Indiana, sometimes things come to you just by dint of being that institution. And
Oh,
so the
yes.
State Department had reached out to me while I was still there and said, hey, we've got a lot of embassies that are asking us a lot of questions about how to do online learning effectively, and even some, administrative leadership planning type questions. Can you work with us on that? So I'd put together a series with them, really, of talks with different embassies. And this paper actually stemmed from that because I realized I was being asked to talk about the same things from one context to another. It didn't matter if I was talking with Morocco or Pakistan or Bosnia Herzegovina or Poland or whoever. They were largely asking a lot of the same questions. And we talk a lot about online instruction and how to design it, but there's not really a lot out there for leaders and decision makers that starts to expand past the scope of that. So I'd taken my talks, which includes my PowerPoints with some visuals and stuff, and that was really the basis for the paper. So a lot of my visuals are in that paper. I'm happy to pull that up if folks want, but I thought it might be where I'm at right now with this idea is there's kind of different ways to turn this idea of an ecosystem around in your head. And I'm working on a book right now through Norton on designing effective online learning. And I wanted to encapsulate around that the planning aspect of this. How do I also bring in some ideas for planners and bring, again, some, frameworks from our field for that. And so that's a little bit of the new stuff, but where
Is
I'm
it
toying now.
W.W. Norton?
Yeah.
W.W. Norton. So in 1993, I was experimenting with blended learning, and we used Norton Textra Connect. It was a synchronous tool. Students could chat with us in the classroom from their dorm rooms. And we compared Norton Textra Connect to Vax Notes, digital equipment. And so we compared async to sync.
Yep.
And we found all sorts of things. I could elaborate on what we found. It was a very interesting study. So in the 90s, I was looking at async mostly in my research, but that was the one synchronous tools from Norton. I just found that interesting that you mentioned Norton because, so we found people want to talk in Norton asynchronous, really short. The more thoughtful posts were happening in the async, and the more reflective kinds of things. We do role play, more pedagogical things we could do, but they interacted, engaged a lot better in the sync. Yeah, just like we do here in the chat, folk can call up and we can connect and we can explore and all that.
Yeah.
So
and I will tell you, I've really loved working with the editor at Norton. This will be my second book with them, and they understand their audience really well and how to gear things towards the audiences that they serve. And so anyway, so I'm shaping this book. This is kind of post-pandemic. Again, folks are having a lot of questions. Carol had reached out and said, hey, why don't you put a book together on instructional considerations? And I said, that's fine, but I really want to wrap some more systems level planning ideas around this. That I don't think that there's enough of that out there. There's a lot around the instruction piece, but not so much around the planning piece that can help, like an educational leader or system level planner, whether it's at the district level or school or an institution of higher ed. There's not a lot of great resources for them that's bringing a sort of research anchored perspective to how to do this. So as I've been noodling with it in that space and trying to figure out, okay, how do I break down this idea? There's really kind of two key components to it that I think are, and again, I'm noodling, right? So I'm still kind of teasing some ideas out. But I think, first of all, the way to think about this is that online learning should be part of an educational ecosystem. That for too long, we talk about face-to-face classroom and blended as competing ideas, versus, right? It's sort of baked into how we frame a lot of our research, online learning versus face-to-face. And the rhetoric around it tends to reflect that as well, as if you're somehow having to choose between these two options. And so I've really wanted to reframe this as more of a yes and, right? Or a both and instead of an either or conversation. So how do we think about online learning as fitting within the overall educational ecosphere? And what does that mean for a planner or a decision maker as they try and figure out, when would I want to use face-to-face, or what makes sense for that? How do we want to leverage online learning as part of what we're doing? How does blended learning fit within that space? Because in some cases, blended learning is the stitching between the two that's really important, that allows individuals to go between different spaces. So it's an important part of that puzzle as well. So we've got this idea of ecosystems as online learning itself, being part of that ecosystem. And then there's also the other idea, which is what I explore in more detail in the paper, of when we design online learning, we're not simply designing courses or even curriculum. I think a lot of folks, design a curriculum and they kind of stop there as systemic planning. But this is what I've done, like I said, for the past 20 years. I've stood up online programs. And the ones that are really the most effective are the ones where we build an ecology around that learning. We're not just simply delivering the courses, and students aren't just checking off curriculum. We're wrapping community around that. We're connecting students to resources. And in some ways, it kind of makes sense. Like, I feel like this is a really basic idea that we intuitively get, but we forget to apply it to online learning. Because for face-to-face learning, if you think about campus-based learning, when we bring students to campus, we don't just give them courses, right? That's not all that we do. We have all of these other supports that are taking place around students in order to help get them from A to B, from admission to graduation. That includes everything from social supports like, community organizations, or just having a space to meet up with friends, to financial aid services, career services, having access to faculty outside of class, libraries. There's all kinds of resources that we wrap around those students to help create that story of success for students on campus. Well, online learning in many ways is really not that different. We need to be able to support students in many of the same ways and in some different ways as well as part of that online learning experience. So rather than just thinking about how do we design online learning, which again tends to stay stuck at that instructional level, how do we then think about what is that overall ecology that we want to wrap around a learner that ensures success for our learners? And, what are the different services that we need to connect them to, the different supports, different opportunities or types of engagement that happen outside of classes? So how do we think more systemically and more holistically about what we're designing when we design online learning?
So we have a question in the Jamboard for you.
Okay.
While we're waiting for that question, I'm going to ask a favor and see if you can maybe share with us your screen and show us one of the figures or two of the figures from your article, so that it might nudge additional thinking and so forth. Who has the question in the Jamboard? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so this is I usually animate this to kind of build it, but this is the idea that I'm talking about, that we've got the different courses that are sort of your micro components of your online educational ecosystem. But then around that, we want to wrap connections to career services, social events, maybe school counseling, or mental health services, library, teacher, faculty access, or whatever. So this is sort of one layer of thinking about the educational ecosystem.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Now, who wants to pose their question or an additional one? Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Bonk, I think. Okay.
Go ahead, Bo.
Yeah, so I've not read the EDUCAUSE article yet. I'm actually really intrigued by that. I work for a company and we developed a blended and online learning class for K-12 teachers. And as I've gone through the discussion postings, that's been one of the big pushbacks was we tried this during the pandemic and it didn't work. So I'm really glad to see what the title of your article is, and I'm really excited to read through it and to find out a little bit more about what your findings were with this. What specific message would you recommend replying to some of the negative responses such as that?
You know,
So, by the way, Stephanie,
Uh-huh.
Bo's up at Indiana University North.
Okay.
He's up in Lafayette, which we normally call Purdue. We'll just call it Indiana University North. So.
Right. So first of all, I think that the idea of emergency remote teaching, and like that, like I said, that seems to be like a really resonant term. When we talk with folks, I tend to use some metaphors. I think metaphor, again, the English major in me coming out, right? That some metaphors are really helpful here, that when a crisis or a disaster hits, and let's say, it's a forest fire or a hurricane, if you have to stay at a temporary shelter, why would you draw comparisons between the cot that you sleep on at the Red Cross to your home and your bed? Of course, those are different. So what we were doing under emergency circumstances, right, as we were dashing out the door, grabbing what we could to take with us, you're not going to have everything, and you didn't have the time to have everything. And so, that's a very different thing from online learning, where we often take a lot of time to plan that and design that and develop that very carefully. And we know that design matters. We know that those design decisions matter. So I also tend to come back to the theme of design. Like if you read Barbara Main's research, for example, or any of the meta-analyses on online learning, there's a really persistent theme across that of design matters. In other words, it's not so much the modality, but the design decisions that we make that really lead to those learning outcomes. And so what we were able to design and develop in 2 or 3 weeks is very different from what we can design and develop under normal circumstances, right? When we have more time, we have more resources, things like that. So I wouldn't expect the emergency cot that I might have to sleep on at a Red Cross to compare with my normal bed at home. But if I had the time, to go back and build my home, rebuild my home, whatever, and select the mattress that I'm going to sleep on and how it meets different criteria and things like that, of course, that's going to be a better experience. So, what we had to do as emergency measures just is not what not the same thing as what we would do when we have more time for planning. So I hope that helps. Does that help address some of that, Bo?
Yeah, that's great. That was a phenomenal analogy. I wish I had that 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I appreciate it, Stephanie.
Sure. I find design to be a really compelling way to frame things as well. That when you start to talk with folks about, in the book I'm working on with Norton right now, I talk about one of the studies on students with ADHD during the pandemic, where the findings in that study were that students with ADHD struggled, Well, if you just take that finding, it sounds like, you would conclude that you should not use online learning for students with ADHD. But if you really look at that study and start to unpack what's going on in there, you actually start to identify different variables. And another way of saying that is different design options or different design constraints of, for example, a full third of the students in that study were not given any materials for remote learning. How is learning going to happen under those conditions? And we're talking about students with ADHD where they were only getting about, I forget what the percentage is, but when the shift happened to emergency remote teaching, the services and the supports that they had been getting before for ADHD, most of those services and supports were removed from those students. So of course they struggled in that environment. Could you design an environment differently that functioned better for those learners? Yeah, in fact, you can unpack a lot of those failure points. What didn't work, what was going wrong. You can flip all of those around into different design decisions for how to better support those learners in an online learning environment. So I find design as framing to be really compelling, and I think that resonates with a lot of folks who I talk with as well.
So Ga has a question. He tried jumping in earlier and I cut him
Sorry.
off. So Ga,
Okay.
and Ga's in our business school, the famous Kelly Business School, in charge of the technology in the building. So what's your exact title, Ga?
Executive Director of Digital Technology. So
Executive Director of Digital Tech. So
Yeah.
with a huge budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. No, I'm just
No.
kidding. No, he
that's
wishes.
actually going to be the question of tonight for me is I often hear a lot of things on reviews and elsewhere and then great research and everything. So this morning I read your paper and all of that actually speaking. And I have very hands-on experience with Kelly Brack, which is our online video.
Shoot, I'm having a very hard time making out
Yeah,
what you're saying.
Your audio, I'm picking up most of it. I can interpret.
Okay.
Is this better?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, all right.
perfect.
For this, I actually have a new mic, and then I'm just, it's a wrong button to flip. All right. So, as I said, it's a very personal topic to me because I work with Kelly Direct, which is a online MBA at our university, and it's consistently ranking as #1. Everybody applauds like, hey, you guys did a great job and everything, but I'm the person who knows the cost behind it. And also, when I read your paper, the ecosystem really speak to me because to support the #1 program, we did create
right.
a whole ecosystem starting from recruiting to student services, financial aid, career service, alumni relationships, and donor engagement, everything. So basically, I have an analogy in my weekly discussion. The analogy is it feels like growing a Tesla in the GM company or Ford company. It's just very, very hard to achieve. Somehow people did it, but not with like a significant cost, or sometimes even battles have to happen. So when reading your paper, I feel like this is the right direction, but my big question is, I understand the why, the what, but the how part, because I know how we did it, but I'm curious, like if I have to live through again, I don't know necessarily I'm having the gut to do this again with creating the different technologies and everything. So to give you a context, Kelly Direct use quarterly semester, where the rest of the IU is using regular semester, spring, fall. We have spring, fall, summer, winter. And our application process is actually different. So to be in the Kelly Direct, you apply for Kelly Direct first. And then once we admit you, you have to apply for IU. So in a sense, the two ecosystem we have actually doesn't really merge together. They're kind of, a lot of people at IU call us the evil twins. They look at us for the money we bring in, but they actually looking at our curriculums and everything is different. You're looking at entirely different institution. So my question is, do you think that's normal with two ecosystems exist in the same environment? Or do you think that it's better to have one? If so, how do we create one that fits
Yeah.
both?
I've certainly, I mean, I think both models are out there, and that's interesting in and of itself, right? We can start to ask good questions about which approach is more effective, depending on which metrics or outcomes you're really looking for. I've primarily worked in contexts where online learning is part and parcel of the institution. It's not a separate entity like Purdue Global or, you know, the ASU Online or, you know, anything like that. I mean, if you want to, in fact, you know, at some point you should have Heather Tilburg Webb in to talk, because she's a VP at SNHU right now, and that's an entirely separate model as well. It's a fascinating one. But I think probably because of my background and, you know, where I've predominantly operated, my inclination really tends to be more towards an integrated model. Part of that is because what happens when you have these separate models is the students who are in those separate programs start to be treated as really an entirely separate community. And it even comes out in comments by provosts. In fact, I think the president of Purdue Global was somebody I was quoting for a while, because he said something about how online learning is substandard to face-to-face. And I thought, I wonder what that makes his students feel like when their own president makes that kind of comment, that the learning that they're getting through that experience is substandard. It creates a sort of caste division, if you will, in higher education. And so I don't think that that's really a functional way to build a community. Certainly that's idealistic, but again, having worked in an environment where we've done it differently, I don't think it's impossible. At UVA, when I started there, my first, I was in the College of Engineering. And our challenge there was to design an undergraduate engineering program that it was really a 2+2, where students took their first 2 years at the community college and then finished their last 2 years with us at UVA. But they did those last 2 years online. And creating an online undergraduate engineering curriculum, especially in the last 2 years where you've got more complicated labs and stuff, that was a really fun design challenge. So it was appealing to me. But part of our goal was when I got out there, I just worked with a fabulous assistant dean, and then he became associate dean, who, you know, when we sat down, we talked about what is our vision for online learning. We really did start with a visioning piece, and I think that's a critical part of it. And, you know, how did we want students who were at UVA physically to interact with those who were at UVA or remote, right? Who were going to be participating online or remotely. And we really wanted those remote students to feel like they were part of the UVA, that they owned that university as much as anybody else, that if they wanted to come to a football game or whatever, that they felt like that was their home, their, you know, their university, that academical village belonged to them too. Conversely, we also wanted our on-campus students to see those online students as co-equal learners in the learning space. And so a lot of design decisions that we made from there or from that point forward really flowed from that philosophy and that perspective. So we did a lot of interweaving of not just classes, but also special events, you know, inviting alumni to connect in different ways with folks, things like that, so that it was really an integral program within the College of Engineering, not something separate. And we also commingled budget lines and things like that, so that it really was just part and parcel of what we were doing in the School of Engineering. After that, I went to the School of Education and was in a sort of part faculty, part instructional designer role, where our objective there was to develop the first fully online program for the School of Education. at UVA. And again, we had a preliminary meeting with the whole team to talk about what is our vision for this and how do we envision things like those relationships between on-campus and online students. If we described that in an ideal set of interactions, what would that look like? What do we believe is necessary for online student success? And not just from the research perspective, but also getting people to bring in their different views on that as well. So we use that as a way to build an actual vision and a sort of, soft architecture for what we really wanted this program to look like. And again, we wove it in to the departments and the programs, in ways where like that online program was embedded in the department. It wasn't in a separate unit or anything like that. It was something that chair oversaw. And I remember even, conversations with that chair were really interesting because her name is Stephanie as well. And when I was being interviewed for that position, it was really clear to me that she was really skeptical about online learning. And during the interview, I even asked her kind of pointedly about that. I said, I'm detecting some of your skepticism about this. Like, tell me what you're worried about, and let's have a conversation about that. And so with her, even over time, those conversations changed from skepticism about what we could do to really seeing this as a viable option within the overall ecosystem of options. But that's not something that you get to on day one or even year one. That's something that you get to over time. And I feel like it's always this process of proof of concept, that even though I've done this for 20 years and I don't need it proven to me, with somebody else like that department chair, we kind of have to go through these proofs of concept with folks and even do some things that might feel anathema to us. Like I think in both contexts, they wanted to know, well, how is this comparing to face-to-face? And so, immediately, like all my everything on me is like, please don't ask me to do a media comparison study. At the same time, taking a sort of evaluative approach to that, like I was like, I feel confident enough in what I'm going to see as the results because of hundreds of studies and what we've done, that sure, put it to the test. We're going to get the feedback that shows students are learning, their perceptions of it are strong, all of that stuff, so that we can kind of dispel with that and then move forward from that point forward. So I feel like another component to that may even be an interim evaluation where you as a team are saying, okay, let's just deal with the elephant in the room of this comparison. And then once we can determine that there, students are learning, that they're happy with us, all this other stuff, then we can kind of move on from there and really continue to build and flesh this out. But, and then I just very quickly, I think the third idea here is that you don't get to that ecosystem overnight, right? You layer that on over time. There's no way you can do all these things that I've got on my screen in year one. But you can start to build those relationships. You can reach out to the library and start to say, hey, how can we integrate some things here? You can reach out to career services or whoever and start to build some of those components. And then over time, just keep layering that on, so that I think in my experience, by year 3 or 4, that's when we've got a really robust ecosystem in place.
So I will mention that 16 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, the School of Business asked me to coordinate a team doing research on our online MBA program. We did at least a dozen different studies and published 24 different articles and so forth. So I am aware of the program there, but a lot has changed since that time. It was like being a kid in a candy store. They had new money, how much just every student was bringing 60,000 for 70,000 for every student. They went from 12 students to 1,000 in a matter of 2 or 3 years. So it was like 6 million new dollars, and so to
Yep.
spend 50,000 or 100,000 on evaluation was nothing. It was a drop in the bucket
Nothing. Yeah.
to them compared to people in the School of Education. By the way, you might want to stop sharing your slides so I can see if Megan or Sun may have a final question. Do either one of you want to jump in here?
I have a question.
Yeah,
So actually at your online educational ecosystem framework, so actually what kind of roles of peers do? That's because I'm interested in peers, students in online learning. So what kind of roles? They just to that system support to, peers to work well in online system, or there
What
is
kind of,
special
I'm missing a word in there. What kind of what?
roles for
Yeah.
peers.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I'll kind of walk my way through how I arrived at this, So when in engineering, for example, when I was helping them develop online learning, I spent a lot of time in those classes wanting to observe, okay, what does the instructor do in this class? What are some of the resources they use? What are the interactions that they tend to facilitate? And side note, it was kind of adorable. I love working with engineers. They were adorable to me. And they would often pull me aside and say, I'd love to interact more with my students. What can I do? One was just so sweet. He said, I know I look at my chalkboard all the time, and I've always got my back to my students. Can you help me change that? So, these
Turn around.
Right. So these were great general instructional conversations that we were having as well. But as part of that, and we read about this in the theories and in the research and things like that. But I think when you go sit in a room and you start to think to yourself, what are the peer-to-peer interactions that are happening that are supporting this environment? And how can we ensure that some of those same interactions are able to happen online? I think that's when you start to see those more clearly. So for example, I'm sitting in the back of the room in a course, instructor says something, and I see two students in front of me, and one of the students, turns to the others like, I didn't understand that. Did you understand that? And the other student's like, oh yeah, it's like this, blah, blah, blah. And they start explaining it in a different way. Well, that's sort of back channeling, right? In a learning environment in the classroom is really important. And so, so how peers play a role in this is something like that. Being able to have a back channel where you as a student can reach out to another student and say, I don't quite understand this, or I'm struggling with this, or can we meet up together and just work on this together, or things like that, that they're not the formal interactions that an instructor might design into the learning environment, like discussions or these, events like this. They're those informal interactions where actually a lot of learning takes place. I've got to go back to some of the research on this, but I remember at the time, David Feldman was out there for a while. Do you know David's research, Kurt?
I know the name, but I haven't read it.
He'd worked with Richard Clark on some stuff.
Oh, okay. So the Clark and Cosma debate, R511 again. We had Cosma was a guest in this class. I'm hesitant to bring Clark in because he's a curmudgeon. This is being recorded. He's a very kind individual.
He is a very kind individual, yeah. But so and Dick had gotten off into like cognitive task analysis and stuff like that. So David was doing some of that as well with him. And David's work is really more in like STEM education. And so we were, and I was in engineering, so we're talking about STEM and of course how the environment is chilly for women. Well, one of the main reasons that STEM or engineering education tends to be a, quote unquote, chilly climate for women is because they get cut out of those more informal interactions that happen, like being able to meet up with peers or turn and ask a question, or, go ask the instructor a question after class or something like that. So when it comes to peers, I'm often thinking about what are those connections between peers that are happening naturally in a face-to-face environment that support learning in an important way that we want to capture in the online learning environment. For example, how can we enable back channeling? How can we set up a system where students can just, they can set up a time to meet up on Zoom or in a chat room or whatever on their own outside of a formal class? Where are those supports that allow them to do those sorts of peer-to-peer interactions outside of class, as well as the peer-to-peer interactions in class?
Yeah, thank you so much. So anyway, you think that peer interaction is important in online learning, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's
Okay.
just like I was saying, and I'm using the chilly climate as an example of that, but I think David said at one point that there is something like over 60% of the learning really occurs in those informal interactions.
Mhm.
And so it's not only with peers, but that's a really important space to consider. So if we're not designing that in,
Mm.
we're really curtailing some important learning interactions. And in fact, so there was a meta-analysis by Bernard et al. On types of interaction. This is like really heavily studied. And the interesting thing from that paper is that interactions kind of look more like a structural equation model if you think about their relationships. That student-to-student interaction and student-to-instructor interaction really facilitate student-to-content interaction. And that's what leads to those learning outcomes. And so, if you think about that model, right, that relationship, if you suddenly take the peer-to-peer out of that, you're missing a really important element in that model. So I would anticipate, if you compared low peer-to-peer to high peer-to-peer, that you would see some at least significant differences in perception or satisfaction, and probably some differences in actual learning as well, because it's facilitating that student to content interaction.
Stephanie, can I jump in for just a second?
Okay.
One of the things that I've really enjoyed about this course, so this is my second year in the program, one of our classmates took the opportunity to just kind of reach out and invite all of us to like a Zoom social. And that was really nice. My other classmate, he only lives an hour away from me, and he and I, as Dr. Bonk mentioned previously, we had the opportunity to kind of drive down to Bloomington this past weekend, and it was really nice. It's been the first time, I guess, in the last year that I've really felt like a student from the social aspect, but there's been so much informal learning that's taken place during these occurrences as well. My wondering is then, like from the design perspective, are there things that the designer should or could possibly be doing to encourage these types of interactions to take place more organically throughout the process?
So in fact, let me see, I'll just share this again here real quick. So one of the first programs where I designed all this was actually back at UNC Colorado, where we were designing the blindness and visual impairment program at UNC. And what we did to intentionally facilitate that, now this design is going to sound dated, granted, but you can adapt all of this. But we created a web page for the program that emulated all of the different buildings on campus. And then that connected students to those services or to individuals there. And we also created a student center that had discussion boards and a chat room and time zone clocks, because we had students across different time zones. And so that was a place where they could go and just connect up with each other for whatever they needed. And I tend to think of this as more like being a civic engineer or I'm sorry, a community designer or builder, that I'm not exactly setting up the spaces and telling people how to use them. We're just building the infrastructure to make that happen. So I'm not, when you build a city, when you do city planning and all of that, you may have like a community center over here, and roads here and there and whatnot. The people are the ones, the community are the ones that start to fill in that space and determine like, how is that being used? When is that being used? They can't do that if you don't give them the infrastructure, but there's also only so much you as a designer can do, right? Like you can't force that community, you can't force those interactions to happen. But you can set up the spaces that encourage that allow that. And what we found, for example, in students with this program was that we had to actively encourage them and in some ways actually give them permission to go in and use these tools because they were very reticent to do it without an instructor present. They felt like they had to do that. And yet on campus, students go to the library all the time without an instructor present. They don't feel the need to get permission for that. Yeah. So here we felt like we had to very explicitly tell students, this is for you to use for reasons and maybe reasons we don't envision, but this is your space to create and fill and use as you want. And, about a year or so in, I think that finally clicked for them. And so you'd see really active discussion boards on, sharing tips about classes, or, we'd see chats scheduled where students were meeting together for a study group or whatever. But I think of this piece a little bit more as like intentional infrastructure building. And then maybe with online learning, I don't know how much this is true now. You can see we were doing this back in 2000, but I feel like there's still this element of telling students it's okay. This is the purpose for this space, and it's okay for you to use it that way. Maybe priming that, like maybe identifying a few community leaders who can help initiate and organize things, who are students, not faculty. But otherwise setting up that space that's sort of to be defined by them.
My next thought on that, I was on a call today with the D2L company, the Brightspace Learning Management System, and they were just asking me, okay, what else do you need from us? What else can we do for you? And I said, one of the things that I would really like to see is exemplars of how other organizations have used the space that has been provided. So your infrastructure really here. And I think that maybe something like that would spark some ideas for students in these online organizations, online communities, online educational systems, to say, okay, last year, this group got together and they utilized our system to do this, this, and this. That's a great springboard opportunity for us now. And I know that we've used Canvas. There's opportunities in there for us to reach out to one another, partner up on projects and stuff, but not always so much the social or the informal aspects of like this. So yeah. Sorry, Megan, I think you were wanting to jump in too.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
I was just going to say, I had this conversation with Dr. Brush, actually Kim and I did last year, because she and I worked together on something. And I think it may address a couple of questions. I had a different question, but it's gone. I mean, I don't need to ask it now because I would have answered this, but like one way that would force it almost, but without requiring it. And I wonder how this would work, because I know I'm not the only one, but discussion posts don't really do it for me in terms of getting a lot out of it. And right. I've done, ones where I post 10 times a week and ones where I post 3 times a week, and I read or I've moderate. I've done a lot of different structures of discussion boards since I started this program. And I was actually in a great online program before this, out of UT Martin, University of Tennessee at Martin. But I really get a lot out of talking about it. And I was talking to Dr. Brush about this, and I was like, is there some way as an option where groups of 2 or 3, because if you get more than that, you end up having too many people talking and only one person writing in that. But during discussion posts, if you want, you can work in a group of 2 or 3, get on Zoom, have a discussion, and then collectively write a post about that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Because to me, talking about it, so much more beneficial. And that is the one thing but also you can't require it because not everybody's going to want to do that. Or I mean, you
Right.
could, but I think some people
Schedules
just
or whatever.
want to do
Yeah.
it themselves, right? But I know I would love that, and it's just me. And that, Bo, to your point, is a way to sort of start to build those relationships by allowing or encouraging that discussion for a class assignment in a way. You know what I mean? So I think that might answer both questions. I just, for me, and here we are at the end
Yeah, I
of
have
my
So
program
Stephanie,
here, but
we'll,
Oh, go ahead.
this will
Yeah.
be your last response, I think, just so we
Sorry.
got a
Okay,
break
yeah,
after
sorry.
this. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I actually have a good example of that. I teach a class on ethics, and as part of that, I have students pick an additional reading, depending on what their interests are. And so we set up book clubs as part of that class. Now, I give them discussion boards if they want to use it that way. But I very proactively and explicitly tell them, if you guys would rather meet some other way for this, then you're welcome to do that. And across several of my classes, I even on week 1 have post a note saying, you may find that peer support is really valuable throughout this class, but I'm not going to manage that for you. For me, that's an additional load as well. And so here's some tools, or here's some things to get you going where you guys can self-organize study groups and support each other throughout class. And I make it very clear, I'm not going to manage this for you. But also it's that explicit part, right? In online learning, we have to make a lot more explicit for our learners of saying, you may want to do this. And if you do want to do this, here's some tools, here's some infrastructure for that, right? Where you guys can go do that. And I'm not going to check in with you. That is your space. You go do what you want. So yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to bake it into classes as well as wrap it around your programs.
Megan, did you want to say what Dr. Brush's solution was?
he just said that's a great idea. We should try that.
I'm just wondering what I should know. So
I don't know if that ever came to anything. He might have forgotten about it on his sabbatical, but he's like, "Oh, I like that idea." I'm like, I do what I can.
He's on sabbatical. I'm sure he'll forget at bedtime. So, Bo, do you want a final 10, 15-second comment? Because you look like you want to speak.
I was just going to say, the opportunity to converse on these optional Zoom meetings has been amazing. Stephanie, thank you, first of all. But
My pleasure.
These times have been great because it's allowed me to, one, Megan and I've talked offline or on Zoom before, independently. Christian and I have connected really well, and it's neat how we've been able to gravitate towards one another in an online environment similar to what you would see in a face-to-face setting. And I've really appreciated these opportunities. It's been fantastic.
And you and Christian coming down Friday and sipping beers with me at Lenny's was highly valuable as well. And you're probably having one now. There were a couple of things I didn't get a chance to ask Stephanie, so I'll try to ask her in the spring when I invite her and Heather to talk about their book and also ethics on the week in 511. If you take 511 with me, we might hear from Stephanie again if she agrees, and Heather agrees. Heather's a good friend, but
She's awesome.
She's awesome. She's totally awesome. Does she live in New Hampshire, or does she live still in Boston?
They're in New Hampshire now.
So Southern New Hampshire, you okay, great.
Yep.
And I think she had a young one when I last saw her. It might be grown up right now.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you how you build your network, your ecosystem that wraps around you, because you've worked with so many different people. That some people I know, a lot of them that I know, some I don't. I also want to mention that you're starting in some ways over as an assistant professor after all these years of going to the University of New Mexico, after publishing a couple dozen pieces, including three books and all this stuff that's in review right now. It's kind of, it's like you're a senior person, but starting over. It's something I actually want to do when I'm, done being a full professor. I want to go back and be an assistant again somewhere and just hang out and see what it's like going through the tenure process again. I think it'd be kind of fun, actually, in some ways, if you have a positive mindset. So I also want to say that Sunme is an engineer. When you talk about lovely and working with great engineers, Sunme she's studying this class and the peer interaction. She's creating roles for us in Canvas and the discussion forums. I'll also say that I have a book in 1998 on this online discussions called Electronic Collaborators. It's got a longer subtitle. My editor thought that was a Nazi spy novel, but Electronic Collaborators it was, with the Lord Earlbaum, Lawrence Earlbaum. And I was a big async person. And like Megan today, I really don't like the online discussion forums as much as I used to. I don't know if my fingers don't move as well. My brain works faster than my fingers. Now my mouth works much faster than my fingers do. But I think AI is going to take care of that, because we're going to speak it and it's going to translate all sorts of things. But I also say the last thing is, if you're interested in the article with Norton Textra Connect compared to VaxNotes, it's called Time to Connect. Just write me an email. And we had one guy in there that was a bloodletter. We had role play, and he was vicious in the role play, but students wanted to see what Jim would say. Everyone was there, they're excited, they're we can't believe what he said, or all this stuff. So, and we also had the smart web for my class, and we had the cafe latte in the smart web. We were reading one guy's book from Harvard called Smart Schools. And so we built the smart web and did all this asynchronous discussion and all this Neo-Vygotskian zones of proximal development and all these things are going on. But we created the cafe latte, and after a while, the students kicked me out, the instructor, out of it. It was their lab, it was their place to speak, it was their place to interact, which sounds like the conversation that we're having now. So my point is, we got a lot of things we can discuss that Stephanie's helped us think about. We've gone well past where I've committed you to an hour, Stephanie, but I'll give you.
I couldn't remember, so.
Yeah, well, I'll give you and Sunmei the final comment, or anyone, but a final comment has to be brief. So start with Stephanie.
Oh goodness, I don't. I guess just a quick final comment is, I find this whole space to be, I think of it as like a canvas, like an artistic canvas, right? Like there's so many possibilities around what we can do, and the creative possibilities are just exciting in this space. So I'm looking forward to seeing what folks put together as institutions figure out that they can't rely solely on face-to-face going forward, and developing all kinds of different possible solutions around this.
Sounds great. Anyone else want to add a comment?
Christian and I talked about that a little bit while we were down on campus this week. Actually, I was just kind of referencing how gorgeous the limestone is, the campus itself, all the new buildings and everything, and then it kind of led into the conversation about we're not exactly sure what the higher ed setting is going to look like in the future because of the outcomes, possibly some of it from the pandemic, but then the possibilities of online learning and what the prospect of that will play for students in the future and education in general. So kind of interesting to see. So yeah.
Anyone else? Megan? No?
I mean, I
Sunmei?
could keep talking, but no,
Yeah.
it's 8:40.
Yeah. So I want to thank everyone for staying a little extra. We're going to take a break. I'll come back, and if you don't want to show up after break, that's okay. I'm going to lecture for about 40 minutes or a half hour or so, and I'll come back to it the following week on smart learning environments. I have a lot of questions about smart learning environments. I could either start today. I'll probably save the questions for next week and kind of give a little overview. Our guests will be Michael Spector, who Stephanie knows full well. If he's smart, no, he said he doesn't know a lot about smart learning, so he's going to brush up. He's written 2 or 3 pieces on it. And Sanjaya Mishra from the Commonwealth of Learning will join us, and they're both wonderful people. So I want to prepare for that. So let's I'll save this to the cloud, stop the recording.